Test. Test.
All right, thank you. minutes? Okay. You guys ready? 2 minutes. 1 minute, probably. There's still some seats up front if you guys want to sit. We're live? Okay. You guys ready? Okay. Well, good evening, and thanks for coming. My name is Sean Adams, and I'm a professor in the history department here at the University of Florida. And I'd like to welcome you to the first History of Capitalism Roundtable, which is an event that we hope to continue annually. And it brings together historical and contemporary experts to weigh in on a question related to the broad history of capitalism, and hopefully with a healthy dose of audience participation. Tonight's topic of anti-monopoly could not be more relevant, in my opinion, as the issues of what actually constitutes fair competition, monopolistic power, appropriate market shares, and I suspect we'll even get to the relatively recent trend of monopsonistic competition at some point tonight, so it should be a very good time. This event was made possible by the Hyatt and C.C. Brown Chair of History, which I have the honor to hold, and I'd like to thank Hyatt and C.C. for their generous sponsorship of the History of Capitalism program here. We have several projects in the works, including a research in progress luncheon series, a comprehensive database of online corporate archives that will be appearing in the next few months, and many more web resources dedicated to the history of capitalism. For more information, feel free to drop us a line at inquire with an I, inquire capitalism at history.ufl.edu. And I'd like to thank some folks for making this evening possible before I get to explaining the format and introducing our distinguished speakers. First and foremost, I'd like to thank David Colburn, Shelby Taylor, and especially Sherry Fiegel, all of the Bob Graham Center for Public Service. They're hosting us tonight, and they have really helped out in terms of making this event accessible to a wider audience. We're very excited about it. They're fantastic co-sponsors, and it means a lot. So the way that this roundtable will work is that after I offer a brief introduction of each of our speakers, they will offer about 10 or 15 minutes of background on a particular aspect of anti-monopoly. Then we'll have a few minutes for any of them to respond to anything that the other one brought up. And then we will have a Q&A with the audience where I'll be roaming around with a microphone. So we really do hope that this evolves into a conversation. So here are our roundtable participants in the order in which they will present. Dr. Richard John is Professor of History and Communications at Columbia University in New York City, where he teaches courses on the history of capitalism. He has written books on the history of the postal system in the United States, which, and my students here at UF who have taken me for the Early American Republic course can attest to this, will convince you that the postal system did much more for economic development than simply deliver letters. In fact, they would often ask me if I was accepting money from them to talk about their importance. I was not. I'm not getting any checks from the Postal Service. His most recent book is Network Nation, Inventing American Telecommunications, in which he explored the telegraph and telephone industries. Plenty of monopoly stories in that field. And in addition to this work, Dr. John has edited several volumes that deal with business and communication, the most recent of which he co-edited with Kim Phillips Fine of NYU, entitled Capital Gains, Business and Politics in 20th Century America. And today he will cover the earliest manifestations of anti-monopoly and antitrust ideas in American history. Our second speaker, Dr. Victoria Woeste, comes to us from the American Bar Foundation in Chicago, where she is research professor. Dr. Woeste has written books on a range of topics, including The Farmers' Benevolent Trust, which looks at monopoly and antitrust in agricultural markets. And I can promise you, once you read Dr. Woeste's book, you will never see raisins in the same benign light again. More recently, she has written about Henry Ford and anti-Semitism, and in particular his libel lawsuit over his support of the Dearborn Independent. Now, in addition to her ongoing interest in antitrust and political economy, she's currently working on some really fascinating projects on Fred Phelps of the infamous Westboro Baptist Church, and also on fake news and its role in disseminating fake information. I feel bad saying this about a fellow scholar's work, but I really wish it was a little less relevant at the moment. Today we will hear Dr. Woeste speak on that great hinge of the history of anti-monopoly, the Sherman Anti-Trust Act, passed in 1890 and still open to a wide range of interpretation today, nearly 130 years later. That seems to me either a genius piece of legislation in terms of its life, or perhaps dastardly in terms of its vagueness and its openness to interpretation. Our final speaker, Matt Stoller, comes to us from the Open Markets Institute, where he is a fellow. He is a journalist who has written for, among other venues, the New York Times, The Guardian, The Washington Post, The New Republic, Salon, Foreign Policy, and Vice. Many of these pieces offer a contemporary perspective on anti-monopoly issues with the insights of a new generation also that we might find familiar, monopolistic entities such as Amazon and Facebook, for example. But he also has a perspective that's very sensitive to a wider historical perspective, and we all love journalists that can incorporate history into their work. His background also includes time spent in the policy world, working for the Senate Budget Committee, as well as a producer for MSNBC. And his most current book, which he only finished a few days ago, looks at the close, I think he might say cozy, relationship between the Democratic Party and large financial interests. And that is coming out with Simon & Schuster. Is there a date on that? Next year? This year? Okay, who knows? In the future, so look forward to it. I'm very much looking to reading it myself. Today he will bring us up to the present, and then hopefully we'll pass it on all to you for more comments. So, thanks again, and I will, without any further ado, pass it off to our first speaker, Dr. Richard John.
Thanks, Sean, for that very gracious introduction, and thank all of you for joining us here this evening. The specter of monopoly has haunted the moral imagination of thoughtful Americans since the founding of the Republic. In the 1770s, the original Tea Partiers attacked the British East India Company. 60 years later, Andrew Jackson inveighed against a monster bank. Early 20th century progressives condemned corporate royalists, and following the 2008 financial crisis, Occupy Wall Street protesters challenged the prerogatives of the 1%. The Revolutionary-era patriot John Adams put it this way, 1765, quote, "Property monopolized or in the possession of a few is a curse to mankind. We should preserve not an absolute equality, that's unnecessary, but we should preserve all from extreme poverty and all others from extravagant riches." Adams, 1765. Well, monopoly then is bad for America, or so generations of Americans have contended for over 200 years. Or is it? The United States is the home to many of the world's largest corporations, the largest military establishment in the history of the planet, a constellation of powerful and largely self-regulated professions, a gaggle of media leviathans, long dominated global markets, and most recently a Supreme Court that has declared unconstitutional any constraints on the free speech rights of any organization, no matter how large or powerful. If, as one historian has proclaimed almost a half-century ago, if the United States is on a rendezvous not with liberalism, but with bureaucracy, then we might well wonder how we can reconcile our nation's anti-monopoly heritage with the enormous reach of the giant organizations it spawned. So that's what I'm speaking about here, our anti-monopoly tradition, these giant organizations. Well, you could respond that the very fact that the United States has called forth so many gigantic organizations explains why we have such a long anti-monopoly tradition. The land of the trust, as a wise historian once observed, and the trust is another name for monopoly, the land of the trust is the land of anti-trust. John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil Trust, as the world's largest oil refiner in the 1880s was known, the Standard Oil Trust called forth the anti-monopoly critique of the journalist Ida Tarbell, the land of the trust, land of antitrust. Yet this response, I think, explains too much and too little. And in particular, it conflates the indictment of monopoly with the assault on bigness. And that's one of the claims I'm trying to get across, but I think it's hard for us today to disentangle anti-monopoly from attack on scale or on giantism, bigness. I think this is a mistake. For the anti-monopoly tradition in the formative era of American history, and this is my assignment, and that's a period that stretched, let's say, from the adoption of the Constitution in 1788 to the emergence in the post-Civil War era of corporate behemoths like Standard Oil, and that came to a close with antitrust, first anti-monopoly law in 1890, that is to say the Sherman Anti-Trust Act. In this period, 1788 to 1890, anti-monopoly was less about scale than it was about privilege, and less about economics than it was about politics. No one brooded in this period about consumer welfare, which is the current legal standard that the judiciary has adopted to determine whether it should block a merger or acquisition. That was not the issue. Consumer welfare was not the center of concern. This anti-monopoly tradition would gradually be supplanted by a different, more narrowly focused economic tradition that Matt Stoller will be speaking on, that has tried to measure the costs and benefits of a particular legal decision. That is to say, to look at what the economic dimensions of large scale are. This tradition, the consumer welfare standard, economic antitrust, has empowered a tiny cadre of lawyers and economists, many of whom specialize in this body of law that we call antitrust. One of the goals of political monopoly, in contrast, was to limit the influence of unelected elites. So we have unelected elites today deciding what anti-monopoly is. The period I'm looking at, we were trying to limit the role of these unelected elites. Well, to consider how political anti-monopoly worked, let me look at two examples. Okay, that's what I'm going to do for you. Two examples. The first concerns an organization that was in certain respects a textbook monopoly, the post office. The largest organization in the country for much of the 19th century, the post office was, for a few years in the 1840s, the target of a well-orchestrated anti-monopoly campaign. Why, critics charged, should the government monopolize the letter-carrying business? We have an anti-monopoly campaign, 1840s, aimed at the post office. Well, what happened? In a few years, the critics had vanished. The campaign was forgotten. Why was this? Well, cynics charged that the post office controlled so much political patronage in the form of lucrative jobs and contracts that neither party had an incentive to break it up. The Massachusetts lawyer Charles M. Ellis had a different, and I think a sounder, explanation. Patronage is part of the story, but not the whole story. The post office, Ellis contended in a magazine article in 1850, though it barred rivals from the letter-carrying business, all right, which is something that monopolies do, legal monopolies, keep people out, keep people in, though it did that, it was not a monopoly in the odious sense. Well, what did he mean by that? Well, in our current democratic state of society, his phrase, Ellis explained, the federal government had an obligation to provide equal facilities, equal mail facilities to the entire population, not by competition, by breaking things up and having a lot of small carriers, but rather, and here I quote, by united and efficient action. No private firm could provide a comparable service, in his view, and should such a firm ever rival the government in its completeness, such a firm being unaccountable to the people would be the most dangerous power in the country. The government, in short, from Ellis's point of view, and from the viewpoint of many Americans, for this anti-monopoly critique vanished, the government was not the problem. It was rather the solution to the problem posed by private enterprise. I could say a lot more about the deep-seated suspicion in the 19th century toward private enterprise, especially on a large scale. This was a suspicion fully shared by many keen students of commercial affairs. In fact, the best-informed critics of monopoly in the 19th century, the leading anti-monopolists, were business people, right? Business people opposed to monopoly. I could say a lot more about this. This was a critique, the critique of private enterprise, that was fully shared most famously by the Scottish political economist Adam Smith. But my point is quite simple. If competition proved unavailing, or competition was not desirable, government ownership beckoned. That is to say, 19th century Americans did not deplore large-scale organizations in toto. They did not deplore them prima facie. Rather, they trained their fire on those large-scale organizations that they deemed impervious to effective political control. So that's my first example, anti-monopoly crusade that disappears because of the nature of the enterprise that the critics were assailing. My second example concerns the electric telegraph, an innovation first commercialized in the 1840s. Now, it's long been a textbook commonplace to hail late 19th century hinterland populists, kind of Kansas farmers, for advocating government ownership of the telegraph. This is a textbook staple. If you've taken a U.S. history course, you've probably encountered it. Why was this? Well, in the United States, unlike most economically advanced countries at this time, the dominant telegraph network provider was owned and operated not by the government, but by a corporation. Europe, the telegraph network was government-owned and operated, not so in the United States. Well, who found this troubling? Lots of people. Not just the populists, but also a well-informed and quite powerful East Coast mercantile elite. Many lawmakers, and even President Ulysses S. Grant, who wanted to nationalize the telegraph. In the course of researching the book that Sean mentioned, Network Nation, I found myself surprised by the influence in the 1860s, 1870s, and 1880s, the influence that these commercially minded anti-monopolists wielded in Congress and in the courts. In fact, Richard White, a recent Oxford History of the United States, public for which it stands, Stanford historian Richard White contends that the anti-monopoly movement of these decades was the most important reform movement in the country, and I think there's a good reason to agree with him. So what about these commercially minded anti-monopolists? Well, they mattered. They exerted through Congress and the courts an influence, a major influence on the business strategy of telegraph companies, and particularly of Western Union, most important, and its rivals. Now, this anomaly puzzled me when I was working on that book, since it's often assumed that the causal arrows pointed in a different direction. That is, that they run outward from the business to the political economy rather than from the political economy to the business. Or to put it differently, the regulatory regime mattered. Mattered then, matters now. Rules of the game. Example, for several decades after the federal government regulated the telegraph with the National Telegraph Act of 1866, for several decades there was intense competition between Western Union and its rival. And this competition was sparked by the law itself. And I don't want to go into the details, but the premise is you've got a law creates competition. Well, what happened? Well, you have an entrepreneurial hothouse between Western Union and its principal rival, which led in the mid-1870s to 4 blockbuster innovations. And what were they? Well, the quadruplex telegraph, or what today we might call broadband, the telephone, the phonograph, which was originally conceived as a recording device for the telephone, because the crippling problem with the telephone was that you couldn't leave a permanent record of what you were saying, and the fourth being the electric power system. So that's a pretty impressive spate of innovations in a very short number of years caused by federal anti-monopoly legislation. To put it a bit more abstractly, as historians sometimes want to do, anti-monopoly in this period shaped the political structure in which business strategy occurred. That is to say, the central dynamic in American capitalism in this period involved the interplay not of technology and markets, but rather of the political economy or the rules of the game and the economic actors for whom the rules of the game had been designed. In the language of social science, political structure was the independent variable, business strategy was the dependent variable. For too long, historians have dismissed the 19th century anti-monopoly critique as nothing more than a backward-looking defense of a rapidly vanishing pastoral world of sturdy artisans and self-reliant freeholders. In so doing, they've made it hard to understand the heirs of the 19th century anti-monopoly movement, from the jurist Louis Brandeis, Texas Congressman Wright Patman, to Senators Elizabeth Warren and Andy Klobuchar today. For throughout the 19th century, anti-monopoly loomed large not only in the popular imagination, but also in the crafting of legislation, the process of innovation, the structuring of the political economy. It mattered. Anti-monopoly had deep roots in the American past. Older than the Republic, it drew much of its emotional power from the principled assault on special privilege popularized by Adam Smith, endorsed by John Adams, it became a central pillar of moral philosophy in the United States in the early Republic. In fact, if we wanted to take a bird's-eye view of the history of our Republic, we might well characterize the decades between the 1840s and the 1880s as an anti-monopoly age, an epoch that followed the more centralized Republican age of the founders and that preceded the more consolidationist, progressive age that would follow it, an age that lasted from the 1880s, say, until the 1970s. Maybe we could then speak of the 1970s to our own day as the neoliberal present. Few 19th century anti-monopolists had a doctrinaire objection to organizational giantism. Huge organizations had existed since the early republics, and many Americans regarded them as a fulfillment of the promise of the revolution. Utopian socialism, it's worth recalling, was invented in the first half of the 19th century, not in the factories of Europe, but in the communitarian projects that flourished in the American Middle West. There's something to the old saw that socialism was invented in Indiana. In addition, most anti-monopolists had no principled objection to the scale of the giant organizations that historians call big business. In fact, these East Coast commercial anti-monopolists that I've been emphasizing often complained that the railroad and telegraph corporations of their day were unnaturally small. Yet, they remained fiercely opposed to the manipulation by these corporations of the political process for economic gain, and they held fast to the time-honored presumption that the citizenry had an obligation to hold the powerful accountable. Like the populists, these commercial anti-monopolists derided big business not because it was too big, but because it failed to maintain the low rates and high performance standards that they could easily have been provided, had been operated for the benefit of the public rather than for their investors. Indeed, the presumption that big business posed a greater menace to the republic than big government would remain controversial until the First World War. Only then, the First World War, would it become common to identify the monster octopus with the government and not business, with the state and not corporations. Only then would the managerial corporation acquire the legitimacy that it would retain largely unchallenged until the economic downturn of the 1970s. We have forgotten this 19th century anti-monopoly critique, at least in part because we've ignored the extent to which our political economy has been shaped by the rules of the game. Many Americans enjoy the board game Monopoly. I know I do. Few realize that this game had originally been invented by Elizabeth Magie, an anti-monopolist protege of the largely forgotten 19th century journalist Henry George. Magie intended this game, which she originally called the landlord's game. She intended the game to illustrate the evils of the unearned increment of land rent, a major concern of Henry George's, and in particular land rent on urban real estate. All right, I'm not going to go into that. We can talk about that later. My point is simple. Many Americans, including myself, enjoy playing Monopoly, not only because we assume that if we lose, we can play again, but also because we take it for granted that we are supposed to play by the rules. There are rules, we'll play by them. Well, Henry George, like John Adams, and like the late 19th century monopolists that I've been talking about, they wanted to change the rules. This was the challenge they posed to their contemporaries and the challenge they pose to us today. Now, it's always risky to predict the future, and this is my final paragraph. Yet it would not be surprising, given the truly egregious financial abuses of the recent past, if we were to witness in the coming years a revival of the anti-monopoly critique that had been in the 1860s, 70s, and 80s such a prominent feature of public discourse. For contrary to a common assumption, at least among my fellow historians, this critique did not take as its target giant organizations, and it originated neither in the fulminations of hidebound reactionaries nor in the pie-in-sky ruminations of impractical visionaries. Rather, this critique drew its principal inspiration from the time-honored and often well-founded objection of lawmakers, business people, social activists, and the journalists who championed their cause, their objection to a political economy in which it could be plausibly contended that business leaders lacked accountability, that giant corporations favored the private interests of insiders over the public good, especially the interest of financial insiders, and speculation clogged the channels of trade. That was the 19th century anti-monopoly movement, and it's a movement, I believe, that has promise for our future as it did for our past. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. I'm always happy to come back to Gainesville. It's like a second home to me because my husband is a Florida Gator, class of 1980, and my wonderful in-laws are here tonight. So I'm always happy to come to. Where's Sean? Invite me back. All right, so I have the sort of middle piece of the sandwich we're doing here, and I'm just going to talk in, I hope, what will be non-technical terms about the changing legal landscape of antitrust after the passage of the Sherman Anti-Trust Act of 1890. One of the greatest social transformations in all of United States history was the shift from a largely agrarian population in the 19th century to a predominantly, one might say, even almost entirely urban one in the 20th. This shift was so gradual that its radical nature went unnoticed for decades, but today we remain imprinted with its consequences. For more than a century, agrarian society and culture were the driving force of American politics. Slavery, tariffs, trade, these and other essential political questions were all filtered through the lens of agriculture's interests. And agriculture's hold on Congress was well nigh unbreakable until secession and civil war blew apart the old order. After the war, farmers maintained an outsized grip on the political economy. The major economic questions that came before the Supreme Court, for example, arose in agrarian contexts. A state-sanctioned monopoly in the Louisiana meat-packing industry, not a civil rights dispute, gave rise to the first interpretation of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. It was farmers who began and maintained the nation's most sustained political protest movement against monopolies. It was farmers who demanded that state legislatures use the regulatory powers of the modern state to temper the growth of corporate combinations, to regulate price fluctuations, and to pass sweeping bans on trusts and monopolies. For a time, the farmers' own political party, the Populist Party, influenced presidential elections and dominated state governments. We have felt the populists' lasting legacy consistently ever since. We even continue to debate fiercely today when anyone stakes a new claim to the mantle of populist champion. But action by the states, though necessary, was not sufficient. The emergence of an integrated national marketplace by 1900 meant that national economic regulation had to move beyond the imposition of tariffs, beyond the mere monitoring of trade. This development, I think it's not an exaggeration to say, lit the touch paper of the ideological divide that has characterized American law and economic policy ever since. On one side of the divide, you find conservatives, states' rights proponents, and libertarians, who all believe in the basic tenets of free market economics and decentralized political power. The other side, consisting mainly of progressive politicians, critics of centralized corporate power, and reformers, argues that the free market cannot exist apart from law, and that legislatures and courts must therefore play an active role in enforcing the rules that promote competition while also curbing monopolies that accrue wealth at the expense of producers and consumers. Now, that's a horrible oversimplification, but you get the gist. And so it was that during the 1890s, a wave of legislative activity began with the purpose of reining in the trusts and defining that elusive concept, restraint of trade. The Sherman Anti-Trust Act of 1890 marked the beginning of that phase. And then followed a period of retrenchment, during which the inadequacies of the Sherman Act, laid bare in a series of Supreme Court decisions, were debated and addressed in ensuing legislation. So I'm going to discuss today that phase of legal development, and I take it up until the Great Depression. And I just want to note that the New Deal did not, in fact, render antitrust law and enforcement irrelevant, quite the contrary. But I'm leaving that part of the story to Matt. The Sherman Act obviously didn't come out of nowhere, and I think Richard's done a really nice job of laying out the political and ideological context for American antitrust beliefs. In terms of the law, the roots of the Sherman Act lay in the English common law of restraint of trade. The Sherman Act leveraged those existing common law rules and codified what anti-competitive behavior looked like. The purpose was so that the owners of trusts, the owners of huge corporations, could know when they stepped over the line. The Act banned practices such as price fixing, non-compete agreements, and other coercive measures that were meant to drive competitors out of the market. But the Sherman Act had to stay on its side of the federal-state fence, too. It could only apply to interstate commerce. So, what could the states do about anti-competitive practices within their borders? They had options. Some states prosecuted corporations for violating state corporation law, that is, for violating the terms of their corporate charters. For example, if a corporation bought shares in another corporation that was domiciled or chartered in another state, then that corporation could be sued in something called a quo warranto proceeding, meaning by what authority, and the state could bring the corporation into court and say, you had no authority to make that stock purchase. And the court would then presumably construe the corporate charter strictly and say, that's right, you have to sell the stock. So that kind of proceeding was one remedy the states had. But at the same time, the states were also competing quite fiercely with one another to see who could attract the most corporations to headquarter there. We think of this as a modern phenomenon, and it's not. It started in the 1890s. And the winners of that particular stage of the competition were New Jersey and Delaware. They relaxed their incorporation policies so that corporations would have a great incentive to relocate. The thing was, most of these corporations that changed their official homes relocated only on paper. So they kept their production and distribution operations in the states where they had already established them. And that meant they were doing business in interstate commerce. And that state regulation alone was not going to address the clearly interstate national dimensions of trust and monopolistic behavior. So, as a result, when the Sherman Act banned every contract, combination, or conspiracy that restrained interstate or foreign commerce and made it a crime for firms to monopolize or attempt to monopolize their businesses, it was already out of step with conditions in the market and in state law. Most legal observers believe that the Sherman Act did little more than codify the common law. The law's general wording led to a sharp divide among later scholars as to whether Congress intended to preserve economic efficiency or to retard the transfer of wealth from consumers to cartels. Now, today the consensus appears to have settled on the idea that Congress believed protecting consumers was a means to achieving competition fairly in the market. In other words, not either or, but both. And if that was Congress's intent, it was manifestly not made clear at the time. And at first, the Supreme Court stuck to pretty well-established rules of constitutional interpretation. The first case to construe the Sherman Act was the infamous Knight Sugar decision of 1896. The court there ruled that law could not touch manufacturing because it was intrastate, happens only within a state boundary. It could only, the federal government could only touch interstate distribution and trade. As a result, a trust that held more than 90% of domestic sugar production was beyond the reach of Congress. It was not enough, in essence, to point to the mere existence of a monopolistic trust. The trust had to actually behave in such a way as to have a malevolent effect on the market. At the same time, the court upheld the law when it was applied to price-fixing agreements among railroads who did traffic in interstate commerce. Firms adapted to this legal standard by integrating vertically, buying up every stage of the supply chain from production through manufacturing and even to retail marketing and sales. As a result, a record number of these kinds of mergers occurred between 1895 and 1904, far more than had taken place prior to the Sherman Act. Talk about the law of unintended consequences. A marvelous young business historian by the name of Laura Phillips Sawyer has written, "The court's interpretation of the Sherman Act made it a good tool for targeting multi-state cartels, but less useful for combating monopolization." And I think it's important for us to recognize that the law tried and failed to keep up with the rapidly changing nature of the corporation and the ability of entrepreneurs to adapt both to the new rules and to new market conditions. So President Theodore Roosevelt initiated the great age of trust busting with a slew of new Sherman Act prosecutions. He won some and he lost some. So, for instance, the court upheld the dissolution of an interstate railroad trust under the Sherman Act And that helped to bring the great merger wave to a close, but antitrust law remained an unsettled proposition. So remember I said the Sherman Law was based on the common law? The common law rule of reason, the idea that combinations in restraint of trade could be permitted as long as their effect on commerce was reasonable, continued to affect how U.S. courts interpreted antitrust laws. Now, the Supreme Court finally embraced the rule of reason as its way of reading the Sherman Act in 1911 in cases involving the Standard Oil Company and its control over pipelines, its tendency for cutting prices to undermine its competitors, and its use of non-compete contracts. But those things would be illegal only if the government could prove that they had restrained trade unreasonably. And I have to point out here, the Sherman Act does not define what constitutes a reasonable restraint of trade. So that left it to the court, and the court took that license and ran with it. In this case, the court did in fact decide that the restraint of trade was unreasonable, and it split Standard Oil into 34 separate firms. Imagine that happening today. In another decision handed down that same day, the court ordered the dissolution of the American Tobacco Trust into 4 separate firms. So the results in these cases look like trust busting. But in affirming the rule of reason, the court had opened the door to all kinds of trust-like practices that would pass constitutional muster as long as they created the facade of reasonability. It's kind of like Justice Stewart's famous observation about how to define pornography. You really can't define it, but we know it when we see it. And that's kind of how the rule of reason was articulated and applied. It was kind of, we'll judge it by the facts. And that meant that bright line, broad rules were really difficult to come by. But during this time, Congress was also busy trying to come up with new ways of dealing with the continuing problem of monopolistic behavior. But instead of legislating specific prohibitions, Congress began creating regulatory agencies whose job was, in fact, to work with business, to sort of coach them on how to set up practices and form mergers that would not run afoul of the Sherman Anti-Trust Act. So we got the Interstate Commerce Commission to deal with the railroads and the Federal Trade Commission to monitor anti-competitive business practices. These agencies were part of a much larger movement to expand the administrative state during the Progressive Era. So what we see here is an increasing reliance by the government on scientific and economic experts to help guide policy. And as a result, what we see during the Progressive Era is the idea that the technocratic management of markets is the sort of scientifically valid way to run a national economy. And rather than oppose such measures outright, businesses did 2 things. They either captured the agencies by sort of making friends with the people who work there, and they formed the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which was a sort of like business collective, and they used their own sources of expertise and information to achieve market efficiencies. And as long as they did that within reason, they were good. Antitrust legislation at the state level both inspired and relied on ideas developed at the federal level. What I talk about in my book on the raisin industry is how the farmers basically since the 1880s had been working to try to get state legislatures to pass antitrust laws that regulated business but left farmers out of it. So farmers would be free to combine into marketing cooperatives to set prices and control production. The problem was they ran afoul of the Equal Protection Clause, and the Supreme Court slapped them down hard. There were, however, only 2 prosecutions of farmers' groups under the Sherman Act in this period that I'm talking about. One involved potato growers in Maine, and they were convicted. The other involved my raisin growers, who jacked up prices after achieving a 90% monopoly during World War I, and were sued by the Justice Department. But Congress came to the rescue in 1922 passed a statute that has yet to be amended that exempted farmers' cooperatives from the antitrust laws as long as they did not raise prices beyond what was, say it with me now, fair and reasonable. Exactly. Good. You all get an A. Now, farmers were not the only group asking for exemptions from the antitrust laws. Labor also desperately wanted to be immunized because their corporate employers were going after labor unions for staging boycotts and strikes, and the Sherman Act gave them the ability to sue for treble damages, which unions simply could not pay. So Congress finally passed the First Amendment of the Sherman Act in 1914. That's the Clayton Anti-Trust Act. And it did contain Section 6, which immunized both labor and agricultural cooperatives from the Sherman Act. It really didn't do labor much good. Boycotts continued to be ruled illegal by the courts, and it wasn't until the New Deal that labor finally won the right to engage in boycotts and strikes without having to worry about being called into court. So let me just sort of now summarize what the rules look like at the end of the 1920s. Was it legal under the Sherman Act for competitors to share information? At first, the court said no, because the effect was anti-competitive, and then a few years later, the court changed its mind and decided that such information as general trade statistics did not by itself constitute a restraint of trade. Was it legal for a market regulatory agency, say the Chicago Board of Trade, to write a rule freezing the price of grain between the end of one trading day and the opening of another? And the court said, well, the effect of the rule is to promote competition, therefore it's okay. Was it legal for a holding company to set prices for all its subsidiaries? At first, the court said not, but then later it declared companies that were free to choose not to deal with resellers and wholesalers who refused to honor price schedules. Was mere size a per se indication of an illegal monopoly? At first, the courts said yes, but by 1920, the court decided that it was not. The mere existence and size of a company were not by themselves proof of an illegal monopoly. Again, the government had to prove that market behavior produced anti-competitive effects. So I'm actually skipping to the end here. You'll be happy to hear that. So on the eve of the Great Depression and the New Deal, antitrust law was written, interpreted, and enforced more as a result of partnerships between public regulatory agencies and private business associations than it was by any formal statement by Congress or legislatures at the state level. The public-private partnership that began under Presidents Taft and Wilson and was encouraged by Presidents Coolidge and Hoover proved unequal to the task of preventing or fixing the Great Depression. With the New Deal, Franklin Roosevelt ushered in a long era of expanded federal power dedicating to rationalizing prices, disciplining inflation, improving employment rates, and shoring up market confidence. The implications of those competing visions of fair competition and free markets continue to shape our policy debates today. And as Richard said, I'm going to echo, how we think about monopolies remains as problematic as ever. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for coming, and thank you. I'm honored to be invited to speak to you today about as part of the History of Capitalism series. So I'm not a professional historian, though it is a treat to hear from both of the speakers so far. My background is as a writer and a policymaker, and I got my sort of experience up close when I worked in Congress during the financial crisis. And what drew me to the historical research on monopoly was the meltdown, 2008 to 2010 or so, and the political response. In particular, how we handled the financial crisis the way that we did in 2008 to 2010, versus the way that we did it in the 1930s. So to shorthand it, I'm not going to talk that much about the New Deal, but I'll just give you the snapshot. In the 1930s, New Dealers broke up the banks and then also restructured the economy, restructured a whole series of industries with breakups, antitrust suits, including airlines, aluminum industry, went after a whole bunch of anti-competitive practices in the oil industry, movie industry. So there was and of course banks, there was a sustained decentralization approach using antitrust law, but also using a whole series of other laws and anti-monopoly tools. So why did we have such an approach in the 1930s and we had such a different approach in 2008 to 2010 when we essentially ratified the centralization of power in the hands of large financial institutions? So the question kind of nagged at me until I ended up writing a book on the history of monopoly and financial power in the 20th century, which will hopefully be out in the next year or so. It's my first book, so I don't know how publishing schedules work. So I'm here to talk about the post-1940 period and offer just like a quick sweep, which was a transition from a relatively egalitarian New Deal state to today's unequal and concentrated corporate apparatus. And the New Deal state was, as Richard notes, a function of this 19th century anti-monopoly tradition. But the change from that era of the 1940s and 50s was accompanied by a parallel shift in how Americans thought about themselves as economic and political actors, which is a shift that I still find jarring every time I think about it. So let's start with where we once were. So in his autobiography published in 1953, Congressman Emanuel Stoller talked about his travels through Europe in previous decades, in the 20s and 30s and 40s. So Stoller chaired a special committee to investigate monopoly power. He thought a great deal about political economics, so I'll just quote him here. I observed what every American traveler took pride in remarking, the differences between European and American tools of living. There must be a reason for this difference, for this concentrated wealth in the hands of a few, and the grim daily struggle for bread for the majority of the people. So he was observing, I was talking about Europe, vastly unequal. And he was observing the political economics of these impoverished former aristocracies and kingdoms versus America, the wealthy, egalitarian democracy. So he chalked these differences up to America's market-based system of small businesses and vital big businesses versus Europe's system of monopolies and cartels. And he said every American traveler observed this same dynamic, so it was well understood. It was the conventional wisdom of the time. So Stoller's passage reminded me of an opening lines from Alexis de Tocqueville, his discussion of American democracy in the 1830s, when he wrote that nothing struck me more forcibly than the general equality of conditions. So what Stoller was thinking about in the 1950s was more than a century-long trend, not necessarily of economic inequality in terms of material conditions, but the self-perception that economic equality was foundational to the American political experiment. So how did this change so radically? Right? Today, no one's like, hey, American capitalism, this beacon of equality, right? That's a crazy theory. Nobody thinks that. It's insane to even imagine it. So how did it change? Right? That's what they thought in the 1950s. It's what they thought in the 1830s. What happened? It's really wild when you think about it. So I am going to trace this change to three men. Okay? And there were more than this, but we always oversimplify, so I'll do it this way. So the first two are on the left. One is a great economist, name is John Kenneth Galbraith. The other one is the great historian Richard Hofstadter, although he was surrounded by a group of people at Columbia University who did this. So it's partially it's your fault, or people at your university, they did this. So both of these guys, Hofstadter and Galbraith, were beautiful writers. If you went into a college room in the 1950s or 60s, you'd probably find at least one book by Galbraith on the shelf, because everybody read them. Galbraith, just to give you a sense of how powerfully he could command language, he coined the term conventional wisdom. Like that was his. He created it. Both of these men had a view that history unspooled in a sort of mechanistic scientific manner, that monopoly was progressive, that it was inevitable. Galbraith created a set of theories that encouraged particularly left-wingers, but kind of everyone in the mainstream, to not see monopoly power. So these ideas were one of them was called countervailing power, but the most important one was this frame called affluence, which was a view that America was just endlessly and automatically productive. Right? And the progressive vision, just America as this beacon of just inevitable progress, he brought that into the economic realm with this notion of affluence. Hofstadter, kind of paralleling that, but in the historical realm, wrote a version of history in which he airbrushed out well-known fights over monopoly power and financial capital, the ones that they were talking about. So let me give you a sentence from Hofstadter's work. It's a beautiful sentence, but it's kind of gibberish. So Americans may not have quarreled over profound ideological matters, as these are formulated in the history of political thought, but they quarreled consistently enough over issues that had real pith and moment. So that's a beautiful sentence, pith and moment. That sounds really pretty, but it also obscures genuine conflict over the politics of production. So Hofstadter he made fun of the idea that there were any real ideological differences between Herbert Hoover and Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1928, 1932. So these men substituted a different vision of social justice, one that replaced the struggle for economic equality and the fight against aristocracy and privilege in the form of monopoly and financial concentration. This is the tradition that the two speakers before me were talking about. They replaced this tradition with a different one. Hofstadter, first of all, characterized those fights as, he said, those fights, yes, they were garbed in the clothing of political economy. People talked about monopoly and railroads and banks, but really, that's not what they were actually about. They were about Anglo-Saxon men who were losing their influence over culture, and they were afraid of the emerging polyglot immigrant society. Populists in the 1890s, they were not farmers who were upset with railroads, they were proto-fascists who were anticipating racist white small businessmen that were supporting the anti-communist witch hunts of Joseph McCarthy in the 1950s. McCarthy really terrified these guys, and they were always looking for, like, where do these guys come from? And what Hofstadter said is this comes from this anti-monopoly tradition, which is really just kind of fascism in the clothing of political economy. So by contrast, Wall Street bankers, they were forward-looking, progressive, cosmopolitan thinkers. Galbraith and Hofstadter argued that the point of politics was not about fighting boorish, though harmless, robber barons, but to work at tolerance, psychological satisfaction, beauty, art, in an endlessly affluent society. Now, the third man was Aaron Director. He created what's known as the Chicago School of Law and Economics. And Director was not a good writer, which is why you haven't heard of him. In fact, he had writer's block for most of his life. But he was really good at seducing other people to his way of thinking. And Director, more than anyone else, broke conservatism away from its traditional skepticism of concentrated power and shifted it towards a full embrace of corporate monopoly. So Director structured what became the Chicago School of Law and Economics. There's some people you might have heard of who were part of it that Director helped flip. Milton Friedman, George Stigler, Robert Bork, Richard Posner. And in the 1960s, the minds of the enormous baby boom generation, which is as big as your generation, they were shaped by Hofstadter, Galbraith, Director, directly or indirectly. So in the next decade, this changeover from the New Deal concept of social justice to this neoliberal framework happened. So here's a passage from Fred Dutton, who was a political operative who helped reorganize the Democratic Party after the '68 convention. So he essentially recommended eliminating the white working class as part of the Democratic coalition in this book called Changing Sources of Power. The balance of political power, he said, had gone from the economic to the psychological to a certain extent, from the stomach and pocketbook to the psyche, and perhaps sooner or later to the soul. So in 1974, a generation trained on these ideas arrived in the Democratic Party. This was Bill Clinton's generation. He ran for office in 1974. That was his first race. It was a lot of the big people in the Democratic Party were part of that wave year. They were called the Watergate babies because came right after Watergate. In 1978, the Republican version came into office in the form of the New Right. This was the class of Newt Gingrich. So from 1975 until the early 1980s, politics restructured around the view that concentrated financial power, monopoly power, was mostly inevitable, efficient, benign, but inevitable. Can't do anything about it, not part of politics. Jimmy Carter deregulated trucking, finance, airlines, telecommunications. Reagan continued, and Reagan also eliminated antitrust enforcement or radically scaled it back. Now, the left noticed Reagan's attacks on government spending and attacks on unions, but they largely, not entirely, but largely missed the shift in antitrust. Okay, enter Michael Milken. How many of you have heard of Michael Milken? Okay. So he was the most powerful banker in America in the 1980s, and probably one of the most powerful bankers in America in the second half of the 20th century. And he kind of belongs to the 1860s or 70s robber baron era. He's a remarkable character, and he kind of is the organizer in a lot of ways, or one of the key organizers of the 1980s restructuring of corporate America. But he had the attitude of a countercultural revolutionary, or at least used the counterculture of the 60s and 70s. So this is what he wrote in 1970. Unlike other crusaders from Berkeley, I have chosen Wall Street as my battleground for improving society. Right? That was the rhetoric that he used. So he ran a kind of economy-wide Ponzi scheme using junk bonds, essentially from the early 70s to the late 1980s when it crashed. And for his own reasons, Milken pushed corporate leaders to focus purely on cash generation. So the corporate raiders that he staked targeted companies that were well managed with large research divisions, prudent cash management, lots of assets like factories, stuff that you could take and that you could sell for ready cash to pay to management. So the raiders that Milken staked, they just pillaged. And they did so in the name of efficiency, using some of the theories that the Chicago schoolers had created. So many of the characters behind the current president, like Carl Icahn, for example, are part of the revolution that Milken initiated. He was an early guy that Milken staked with junk bond money. And it's not just Trump. Mitt Romney, for instance, and there's a lot of Democrats this way too. I'm not trying to make a partisan point. He made his money in private equity, which is the name of the leveraged buyout industry that Milken helped to supersize in the 1980s, and leveraged buyouts had to be rebranded as private equity because the name became somewhat toxic. Now, Milken didn't do this because he was brilliant, but because the political context had changed. The rules of the game had changed to favor a character like him. Reagan relaxed antitrust and white-collar criminal enforcement with little pushback from Democrats. He also worked with Democrats to deregulate savings and loan banks and the financial sector. The Reagan and Carter deregulatory efforts, along with the removal of New Deal rules on finance, opened the door that Milken walked through. So just the prospect of corporate takeovers that would have been unimaginable 10 years earlier, changed the way corporations operated. They changed American society. So between 1984 and 85, so in 1 year, 400 of the 950 largest corporations in North America restructured. Only 52 of them had takeover bids, but they all just were preparing, and mostly what they did is they loaded up on debt. Now, in 1993, it looked like this would change. Bill Clinton took office. There had been 12 years of Republican dominance. The party of the people, the traditional populist, was back. And this is when the new intellectual framework organized by Hofstadter, Director, and Galbraith was firmly solidified because Clinton was a Watergate baby. He organized the government not to roll back the political economic revolution that Reagan had helped initiate, but to take it globally and expand it. There were roll-ups in almost every sector of the economy, so mergers, especially technology, which was sort of the new railroad, Standard Oil kind of empire structures of the moment. Now, the Clinton era looked, to many, like a success. There were wage gains. There was a personal computer and internet revolution in the 1990s. Friends was a good show. I have a policy. I just have to find my jokes funny. But there were shows like The West Wing, right, which was a very popular show, and copycat politicians all over the world, like Tony Blair. And the vision, the result of this was the vision that Clinton promoted was inculcated into how most Americans saw politics. Became bipartisan, like Eisenhower brought the New Deal into the Republican Party. Clinton brought this neoliberal revolution into the Democratic Party. And so questions of industrial organization, which is the subspecialty of economics dealing with questions of monopoly, because economists can't use normal language, questions of industrial organization just didn't matter anymore. Or to the extent that they did, they were reduced to faint echoes of things like the minimum wage, maybe a little bit of consumer protection here or there. Okay, so this brings me to the answer to the question that really nagged at me when I was working on the financial bailouts. So in 2009, Barack Obama was asked why America hadn't taken over the banks and restructured them. In particular, he was asked why he didn't do what Sweden did. Sweden, in the early 1990s, had a banking crisis, and what they did is they essentially temporarily nationally managed the banks and cleaned them up and then spun them out again. Sweden actually based its bank resolution model on what FDR had done in the 1930s. So they saw that America had cleaned up its banking sector in the 1930s. They saw it worked. The Swedish said, hey, let's do that. And they did it, and it did work. Now, when Obama was asked this question, people were talking about the first popular anti-monopoly slogan put forward since Brandeis's Other People's Money, which was a popular anti-monopoly slogan or monopoly slogan in the early 1913 or so. This is the idea of too big to fail banks, right? That's an anti-monopoly or that's a monopoly phrase. So what did Obama say about why he didn't pursue the Swedish model, which was really FDR's model? Well, he said that the Swedish plan looked like a good idea, but there was a problem. Sweden is a small country with a small number of banks. America is a big country with a lot of banks, and it just wouldn't work. Besides, and I'm going to quote him directly, we also have different traditions in this country. In 1953, Americans took for granted an equality of conditions, or at least the sense of self that that is what the American system of capitalism was about. They saw markets as equalizing and monopolies in big banks as threats to a market-based egalitarian system. By 2009, our leaders could no longer tell the difference between a healthy open market and concentrated financial power, and they just assumed that what American capitalism meant was radical inequality. So I'll just close by saying that Congressman Emanuel Seller, who was one of the most important anti-monopolists of the 20th century, would have been very surprised.
Thanks to all the panelists, and I am going to invoke my role as moderator to revoke my privilege to ask the first question. But I do want to ask if y'all have any kind of follow-up points, or we will get to the Q&A, and I have a microphone, and so if you could wait for me to get there before asking your question, and also identify yourself, that would be great. So, you have any questions? I will get you first.
So my name is Amha, and I'm a political science and history major. So this is close to my heart. Thank you for being here today, first of all. My question is, so I'll start off with the big elephant in the room, which is the big tech companies like Facebook and Google. Douglas Rushkoff argues that the biggest issue we have currently with these tech companies is that they're an evolution of a type of capitalism that's based mainly on extraction. And essentially what Google and Facebook are the modern versions of that. They extract data and they extract value from that. So do you think that that's something that we need to address, the nature of sort of capitalism that's built around extraction of value, and that we should, think of a new model, essentially, to a certain extent.
So this is, can you hear me? Is this, okay.
Did you turn it on?
Let me see, just trying to make sure that you could hear me. So Open Markets, the Open Markets Institute, which is, thank you for the question, by the way. I work at a think tank, which is just a nonprofit that thinks about these kinds of problems. And we think a lot about the tech platforms, the tech monopolists, particularly Google, Amazon, and Facebook, which are kind of the leading business structures in the economy. And in many ways, they are extractive, and in many ways, they are not. But I think that the core dynamic to understand about these businesses is that there is a difference between what is powerful and innovative and interesting about, say, Google's search engine or YouTube or Instagram or WhatsApp or any of the other components of Amazon, and the business model and the financial structure of those institutions. So Facebook, people think of it as, say, a social network because you go onto Facebook and you use it. But Facebook, while it is a social network, is also a financial holding company of Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, and about 100 other companies that it's bought over the last 10, 15 years or so. Google, similarly, people think of it as a search engine that a couple of guys in a garage created and this great innovator. In reality, it is that search engine and then a massive financial conglomerate structure that has been used to roll up a whole series of companies. And what is extractive about those companies and what also inhibits actual innovation is the financial structure that has been placed on top of what are actually incredibly innovative and productive, important services. Does that answer the question? Okay. I think, actually, I think your analysis of sort of how we've dealt with telecommunication systems in the past might be useful.
Yeah, Facebook, Google, Amazon are a problem right now for the polity, a major problem. And we've had similar problems in the past. We restructured telecom in the 19-teens by limiting prerogatives of Bell or AT&T, obliging it to divest Western Union. It actually controlled telegraph and telephone, and establishing rules that enabled it to coexist with, believe it or not, the thousands of non-Bell independent telephone operating companies. We also regulated, primarily at the state level, also at the federal level, the kinds of rates that could be charged in services. Now, it's not likely that we're going to be regulating Facebook, Google, Amazon in quite the same way, but this idea that markets in communications should be segmented so that, for example, radio and television would be separate, or that newspapers and post office would be separate, or that telegraph and telephone would be separate, or radio would be separate from telephone, which was not obvious. Those are all political choices, and that is the American tradition. That is an anti-monopoly tradition. It's a pro-commercial, anti-monopoly tradition. And I think if we understand our past, not think about telecom in terms of genius inventors and garage-based entrepreneurs or Garrett-based geniuses, but we recognize that they've been structured by the polity in particular ways that will give us more confidence in regulating in the future. I mean, to put it more simply, we have always regulated large-scale networks. Google, Amazon, and Facebook are regulated today. They just happen to be regulated in ways that are particularly advantageous to those corporations, not necessarily advantageous to the public. We need to recognize that we can change the rules of the game as we have changed the rules in the game in the past to make those corporations more, bring them into alignment with the public good, regulations that I believe will also be conducive to the bottom line of Google, Facebook, and Amazon. So the point isn't to destroy them, the point isn't to eliminate their creative potential, but it is instead, in effect, to regulate them for their own good and for the good of the public.
Can I just add something to that discussion? Just at the beginning of the week, there was an announcement that a group of venture capitalists were going to make an aggressive, hostile bid to take over USA Today and its parent company, Gannett. Gannett owns probably 3/4 of the newspapers in this country right now. Actually, that's a guess. But there aren't very many independent newspapers remaining, and the ones that have gotten gobbled up by Gannett have become mini editions of the USA Today. Nobody, except journalists, is talking about what kind of monopoly is taking place, what kind of merger is taking place in print media. And I think in part it's because newspaper journalism was so far behind the curve in adapting to online journalism. And so a lot of those newspapers have just atrophied away to the point now where they're operating on skeleton crews. And I think if we could figure out a way to translate some of these policy ideas, not just for the, Google and Facebook and these newer forms of data mining companies, and I really like that parallel between data mining and natural resource excavation companies. I mean, it's a really great parallel. But we've got to, we're going to lose independent journalism at a pretty alarming pace if we don't figure out how to stop this trend, this merger trend in journalism.
Just on the subject of journalism, it's not as well known as it should be, but a high percentage of important news stories still come from print newspaper outlets, 60, 70, 80%. Most of what you'll see on CNN or Fox or MSNBC originated newspapers. Now, it's an interesting question. How did those newspapers sustain themselves? It's a myth that they've sustained themselves on the basis of revenue from subscribers. They sustain themselves largely on the basis of advertising. Now, to ask yourself then, well, what do the numbers look like for newspaper advertising? The peak year for advertising for newspapers, I think, was 2006 or 2007. It's not that long ago.
No.
The numbers were going up, and then they fell off a cliff. It's because the advertising revenue has been taken over by Facebook and Google. So they're getting the advertising revenue, but the revenue, therefore, is not getting pushed back into news generation. I feel this quite pointed way. So I'm going to disagree a little bit. I don't think it's necessarily that newspapers, the print outlets missed the technological juggernaut. They interpreted it wrong. They thought that they were going to benefit from Facebook and Google. My colleague Emily Bell published a famous, I think maybe a Columbia Journalism Review article a couple of years ago. It was a post, How Facebook Ate the News. You can look it up. The advertising revenue then went to Facebook and Google. And that is a problem for the Republic. Newspapers have been fundamentally commercially driven since the 18th century. About half of all the newspapers between 1800 and 1820 had the word advertiser in the title. That's because they were advertisers, local advertising, classified ads. All that's gone. It's not coming back. But we've got to devise institutional arrangements if we believe that access to information is a public good and that a republic or democracy thrives. The public is well informed, and it will die if the public is not well informed. We've got to find mechanisms to sustain a serious journalism, And those mechanisms are not the miracle of the marketplace, because that is not the way we have sustained journalism since the 18th century. So you make a historical argument. If you care about the past, if you care about the world of the founders, if you care about the world, Second World War, the world of the 1950s, 1960s, these were eras in which we had all kinds of institutional arrangements, subsidies that were helping to sustain journalistic establishment. That world has largely disappeared today. The most abnormal, atypical period in American journalism history is the period between roughly the 40s to the 70s, when you had the 3 television news networks. And this has led to a very misleading assumption that news is profitable. Those networks had a lock on the market, and they were in effect using news as a loss leader. The Pulitzer Prizes are loss leaders. You would, that is to say, articles that win Pulitzer Prizes in the press. The publishers would empower teams to report on stories that would be of interest perhaps to a small audience, but an audience that were concerned with the public. Right? At one point in time, Walmart discovered, or other advertisers discovered, they no longer wanted to subsidize the Baghdad Bureau. And it's not obvious why advertisers should be supporting high-quality journalism. But it's certainly in the interest of the public that we support high-quality journalism. And that's why at Columbia Journalism School, we have 2 research centers, the Brown Institute and the Tao Center, that are trying to point the way forward. But we are not going to advance if we persist with the really false and dangerous assumption that the marketplace on its own will generate the high-quality news that's necessary to sustain the informed citizenry that's the bedrock of a republic.
I always hate it when people on panels are like, let me answer that question, and then answer it again, and it's like 30 minutes long. But this is a big topic. It's something to think a lot about. So first of all, Amazon's a little different. Put that one aside. When you think about Facebook and Google, most people talk about them as tech companies. They're not tech companies. They're advertising companies. They sell you soap, right? And like people want to confuse everyone with all these weird terms. You know, they go, oh, there's a big privacy debate. Oh, you know, who's spying on you? It's like, no, they're advertising companies. That's what they're doing. They're monopolizing the ad market, right? So just to give you a sense of the scale, Google and Facebook have about 63% of the online ad market, which is the largest ad market of all of the different ad markets in the country, and they also do that all over the world. And that's money that used to go to financing art and entertainment and sports and news and hiring a lot of people to actually produce that content. And now it doesn't. It goes to a few people in Palo Alto, and it isn't because they are producing the value, it's because they sit as intermediaries between the reader of the news or the audience and the producer of the news. That's what all of the tracking stuff is about. People talk about privacy and data, but that's really confusing, right? What these things really are just rules for who can advertise to you and how they can do it. That's all it is. So just to give you a sense of how Google works, okay, what Google does. All right, Google essentially has 4 pots of information or data on you and on our world. One is what you think. So when you tell Google what you think every time you do a search, so a database of intentions is what people call it. That's one pot of data. The second pot is where you go. Like, we all have phones. Google, if you have an Android phone, Google tracks you. If you have an iPhone, Google probably tracks you because they have ad tech components that put advertising in all of the apps that where you go and basically what you do. They also map the world. There are about 2 billion Android phones walking around the world at all times with 11 different sensors mapping everything. They can tell if you're horseback riding based on your movement patterns. It's really incredible stuff. But they know where you go, and this is largely so they can see where you shop, right? So they know if you're on the second floor of a mall well, no one goes to malls anymore, but theoretically, they can see where you shop. The third thing is a pot of information is what you do online, right? Which they have through their third-party intermediaries, their ad tech suite, which comes from a company called DoubleClick that they bought in 2007. Or they bought a whole bunch of other companies. Point here is it's a conglomerate. It's not actually a single business. And then the fourth pot of information is not about the consumer, the individual consumer or user. It's when it's the business information, so the marketing information. When Nestle runs an ad campaign, they spend a lot of money showing people ads about their different products, and then lots of different variants of those ads. They see how that works, then they see if people buy things. Google keeps a copy of that information, so they have knowledge about pretty much every company. They also force people to use their marketing software. Even if you're not advertising on Google, you usually are going through Google software to advertise. These are all companies, like this software is stuff they bought, so it's not like they invented all this stuff. And then they tie it all together, making it really hard to avoid Google. So that fourth piece is basically market surveillance over business relationships in the economy. So these four pots of data, what you think, where you go online, and market surveillance data, when you combine them, it creates a kind of God's eye view of the economy. And it makes it really easy to advertise to you, or so they say, based on what you might be interested in. So it's much less valuable now to advertise on the Wall Street Journal, which is basically a bunch of 55-year-old white guys that want BMWs. Why would you advertise on the Wall Street Journal when you need the information from Google about which of those 55-year-old white guys have been typing in, new BMW into Google search engine? Well, that kind of these kinds of stores of information, which, by the way, when Google bought DoubleClick, they kind of promised the government as part of the merger that they wouldn't combine all of these pots of information. They were like, oh, that would be crazy. That's not our data. And then they went ahead and did it. And they've rolled up hundreds of companies, Google, Facebook, and Amazon. This is remarkable power. It is remarkable power. And there are a number of potential responses. And one of them is to say, well, let's break up those different hives of information. So the database of intentions gets segmented out from the DoubleClick, which gets segmented out from Android, which, you can break those pots of information into different places. And then they'll each cut deals with different advertisers, and you'll see a whole spurt of economic activity and innovation in the advertising space and in the journalism space and content production space. Or you can say, let's put public rules so everybody has access to these kinds of information on equal terms. And in some countries where there are strong privacy norms, they will say nobody gets access to this information. And in some countries where there are lower privacy norms, they'll say, well, everybody gets access to this information on equal terms. But it will be equal instead of concentrated and driving sort of the little business person out of business. So that, if you want to understand Google, this is sort of a discussion that people are starting to get to, although Google puts a lot of money into a lot of think tanks to make sure that we focus on confusing things. But that's the gist of it. They're an ad company. Facebook is fairly similar, although it's not quite as powerful and it's politically clumsier. But that's what these institutions are. Amazon is sort of related, but operates in different segments of the economy.
Hi, my name is G. I'm a graduate student studying economics in industry organization.
Oh.
About what Professor John and Mr. Stoller said, I think it's increasingly becoming challenging due to the market definition and market structure being changed from unidimensional structure where producer in surplus to two-sided or multi-sided platform like newspaper or Google, Amazon. And in the recent development in economic analysis and antitrust is due to availability in data, right? Because we have not only firm and market level, we have individual transactional level data available, and also increasing improvement in technology and computation. In historical, legal, and political aspect, what do you see in these development heading toward in terms of competition policy, litigation type of analysis?
you want me to? Yeah. So, okay. So industrial organizational economics is the subspecialty of economics that deals with big business and monopolies. Is that fair? Okay. Because I'm usually not fair to economists, so I will check with you to make sure I'm faithfully representing the problem. So, G, thank you for the important question. So there's a whole bunch of legal tussling over this thing called a multi-sided platform, which is what a lot of these big companies, they like to say, well, we're not a software service, we're not selling you, soap or whatever. We are a platform for commerce, right? Airbnb, we don't have hotel rooms. We are a platform for different sides of a market to come together. Uber is like this. They say, we're just a market. We don't have drivers. We have independent contractors who have to do what we say. Sorry, that was a little bit. They're not. It's not sort of quite like that, but
Pretty close.
but the idea is that a lot of these businesses are taking this new form, which they kind of like to call multi-sided platforms, which was originated with the credit card industry. Anyway, but none of this stuff is new, and we know how to handle networks, right? And the basic idea is like we have to get back to talking about how these companies make money and making sure that they're not making money through coercive or anti-competitive practices that entrench privilege. That's really all this is about. And if we allow and enable the entrenchment of privilege and aristocracy, then we destroy our markets, we destroy business, and we undermine democracy itself. And I think that's what you're seeing all over the world. It's also what you're seeing in America, and you're seeing deep dissatisfaction with the small community of IO economists and antitrust attorneys who have structured our political and economic conversations to exclude normal people from talking about the world that they live in. So it's a really exciting time to be in these specialties because the world is opening up, and you are talking to a hungry population that wants to know why things are so dangerous. And I guess I'll just end by saying, when you talk to these experts, what they will tell you is, you look at a monopoly, you say, that's coercive, that's a monopoly, that looks like a gangster, what they're doing, by forcing someone to use their service even if it's inferior, or all of these different ways that there's predatory behavior, even though sometimes the products are great. Often it's predatory, and you'll say, that looks like monopoly. And what IO economists tend to say is what a normal person would think of as a monopoly, they would think of as an efficiency. And that's the sort of ideological frame where it's like, oh, well, Google is just efficient. So when they force you to use their product, maybe that's just more efficient. That's just better for the end user. And you can't prove that it's not. And that's the whole, now we have a lot of different sort of changes to market structure that IO economists are wrestling with. But the basic politics of it are as I laid out.
Yeah, one of the peculiarities of our own age is we now have kind of business gurus. I'm thinking of Peter Thiel, but he's not the only one, who are saying flat out that the goal of my business or any successful business is to monopolize. And this is a kind of claim that was rarely made in the past. In fact, you can read an awful lot of business history, and it turns out that there's a concentrated effort to say, no, such and such wasn't a monopoly, or such and such had rivals. And there is a subtle difference there in that there was a presumption that monopoly, that is to say, control of a market, so buyers or sellers, was a challenge to the public good. This was something that we need to find ways to limit or find ways to make accountable. And we're in a moment today when the language of efficiency, the language of consumer welfare, the language of choice has made it hard for us to recognize that economic debates are ultimately debates about power, they're debates about morality, they're debates about ethics, and they need to be construed as such. And that by draining these debates of any kind of emotional, moral content, we are debasing our polity. And so I guess when we talk about this on our own, I'm hoping that these issues are more important, are so important, that we shouldn't leave them to the economists, that we need to open up a public discussion. And having said that, I will put on my historian hat and say that some of the most effective regulations concerning platforms, concerning monopolies, are often the work of a relatively small number of people. They're not necessarily the result of a great popular upsurge. But I will say that without popular pressure, without public engagement, without a recognition that there are genuine stakes here for ordinary people that are not simply something that you can reduce to a textbook or mathematical formulas, that we're not going to meet the challenge of our time.
Any other questions?
Hi, I'm Gordon. Thank you for coming, talking to us. My question's real simple. In the current economic climate that we're in, and I'm not an expert like you all are, but I think that the current way we're doing that, I don't think they prosecute the monopolies maybe as aggressively as they should. But my real question is with the way things currently are, where do you see our economy in 5 years?
Oh, geez.
I'm a historian, so I'll beg off. I don't do the future.
I think, the most I'm willing to say is that antitrust enforcement has really been enfeebled since the Reagan era. And, there was hope that Clinton would beef it up. There was renewed hope that Obama would do better, and he did, but not as much as people wanted. And I think that must be part of the explanation, to go back to G's question, about why there wasn't more absolute fury towards Facebook for permitting its platform to corrupt the 2016 election. I mean, you talk about a misuse of the platform for, whether or not you agreed with the result of the election. I think we can all agree it's not right for foreign agents to manipulate public opinion in a fraudulent way, right? So right there is an indictment of the status quo. And you get, you haul Mark Zuckerberg in front of the Senate, and he's asked, by some geezer in his 80s, how can you possibly make money? So he doesn't even understand that these are advertising monopolies that are completely organized around making money by selling ads. They don't even bother with subscriptions like newspapers do. So I really think that it's going to take an awful lot to summon the political will, the collective political will that it's going to take for, a renewal of the anti-monopoly tradition. As long as we cling to too big to fail and we don't subject to real scrutiny the inner workings of these monolithic corporations, you can always point to the fact that the economy seems to have done pretty well. Right now even it's doing pretty well, and maybe we're due for for the bubble to burst again. So I don't think in 5 years the economy will look any different than it does today. I think we will go through peaks and valleys the way. Oh, I wouldn't say that.
Or one that's not radically out of what's been in the past.
Again, I don't know that I would say that.
We're not going to offer any
entirely
stock tips
possible.
or anything
Can
like
I,
that.
can I
and,
offer, can I offer two different paths, which I think, so I just, so one thing that you saw this week, if you watched the Senate Judiciary hearing, in which I did because it's kind of part of my job to do
Which
that.
one?
The one with William Barr,
Oh,
the oversight.
confirmation hearing.
So William Barr is the new Attorney General, and it was interesting. So the Department of Justice has jurisdiction over the antitrust laws. So I'm a Democrat, and I come at it somewhat from the left. And when I talk to people, people sort of think that antitrust is a left-wing thing, right? Because you're talking language, sort of the language of social justice-y stuff. But it's really not. And it's a business reformist ideology that's about preserving open markets. In this hearing, 4 senators, all Republicans, asked William Barr about the antitrust division and said, there is, well, not all, one of them was like, there's not enough corporate concentration. But the other 3 were, what are you doing about these tech platforms? There is crazy amounts of corporate concentration, and they're destroying markets. No Democrats asked about antitrust. Okay, which is weird, but it's also something that I've seen consistently for a while, which is, now it's really strange. Now, Tucker Carlson, not super left wing, is out there, and he talks about tech platforms on a regular basis, and particularly their monopolistic practices. So this is a changing debate. It's changing on the Democratic Party side. You're going to watch some really interesting things coming out of the House Judiciary Antitrust Subcommittee.
Thank you.
Really interesting things coming out of that. You're going to find there is pressure coming at it from the Republican Party and from the Democratic Party. The old neoliberal era, that age is passing. There are big companies like Walmart and Oracle and News Corp that are very upset with the tech platforms. So you're seeing a war between the big guys, right? So this isn't, you could say the old and the new, but this is not a left-right thing. I always am saying this, but it's kind of this ridiculous habit on the part of Democrats to say, I don't think this left-wing thing is left-wing, but it always is. This is not actually a left-right question. This is a reformist tradition which has populist antecedents that have gone into both the Republican and Democratic parties in a real way. And the reason, when you talk to Republicans, is because Republicans intuitively understand that monopolies are private governments, and they are suspicious of governing power. And that's where the conservative, that old, prior to Aaron director, that old anti-monopoly conservative sense comes into play. And it's a real thing, and it's powerful. And that there's a lot of populism on the left as well, although there's also this sort of technocratic progressivism, which is very favorable to monopoly, which is why a lot of people think Google is very progressive. So I'm very excited. I think that if you break these guys up, you break up companies across the economy, you will see a remarkable outpouring of innovation and economic activity. I mean, it's going to be, and wage gains, it will be awesome. It is incredible what the New Deal did. We do that again. We have unbelievable technology. So this phone, this can be the most amazing tool of liberty that we have ever created. There's so much computing power here, or it can be the most powerful leash that we have ever created. And that it's a political choice which one this is. So just to finish up, you want to see a really scary economic path? You look at what's happening in China, where they are doing sort of Black Mirror stuff on social credit scoring, and that could happen here if we make certain political choices. But an amazing opportunity to create a much freer society, with a lot more business activity, exists if we make other political choices.
Do we have any other questions?
Thank you for being here. My name is Thorne Prego, and I'm curious to know your thoughts on the role of campaign finance in terms of influence and in terms of self-regulation.
It's really not my field. I think it's pretty clear that Citizens United completely transformed the rules of the game. And there's, in a number of different contexts, corporations have been given a status and the accompanying privileges that make political campaigns even more about contests between wealth, between sources of wealth and the kind of influence that comes with that wealth. So I'm really uncomfortable with the idea that that money should equate to speech, but it's that calculation, that equation has been played by both sides for their own advantage. So, you know, it's not possible to just say, oh, well, there's the enemy, and it's all these big corporations, or it's these super PACs. Campaign finance law has never been something we've really thoroughly settled on. You know, there was a limit placed on contributions in the 70s, and the court overturned it. But there are still some limits in place for individuals. So the question is, why aren't corporations limited in what they can contribute? You know, again, that's a political question. Congress, both parties in Congress benefit from the fact that corporations can have these much less limited forms of participation in campaigns. And having run 2 political campaigns myself, I've been a candidate for local office twice in the last 3 years. It is impossible to run for office without money. You just cannot do it. And you certainly aren't going to win if you can't get on TV. Even for, you know, our county sheriff's race was totally fought out on TV. So I don't know what that has to do with monopoly and competition, but it does suppress competition in politics because it weeds out people like, you know, any of you here who might think, well, I have something to give. But you know, the prospect of having to raise the money, thousands of dollars, is just too daunting. So there is a monopoly problem in there. So yeah.
Hi, my name's Tyler. Thank you all for coming. I'm also an economics and international business student. I kind of want to bring things back to the consolidation in news and advertising. So I know that Sweden, many of the newspapers in that country, the way that some of them sort of combated the internet age is the main issue with advertising and news and that going down was the classified ads, because on the internet you get much larger lists of the classified ads, so it attracts more users and more advertisers to the same space. So what these newspapers did is they got together and consolidated their online classifieds and their newspaper classifieds together to sort of have a more equalizing effect where they had much larger market power to combat the larger market power of the internet providers, of the internet companies. So that, although it is sort of like a story of, hey, there's these people combating the large market power, but in itself they're consolidating their market power because the other smaller independent newspapers who aren't a part of this consolidation of classified ads then have to compete with this bigger conglomerate of newspapers. So how do you balance the effects? How do you balance the desire of combating monopolies and anti-monopoly desires when consumers' own actions in the marketplace happen to act against that desire?
Really good question.
Yeah, we've had a large body of law that has tried to limit consolidation on the part of newspapers. For example, could 2 newspapers in one city share production facilities?
Yeah.
The courts have gone back and forth on that. There's a long-standing concern, which seems hard to understand today, but goes back certainly to the 1920s. Should newspapers be permitted to own radio stations, for example? And if so, how many? And what kind of market share would you then generate? Now, I mean, one answer is we could agree with Obama that Sweden is not the United States, that the 2 countries are different. The Swedish government, Danish government, Dutch government subsidizes journalism outright. I think about $200 per capita, something like that. United States, it's about 50 cents per capita. So the market is structured differently to begin with. These experiments in the United States this kind of an experiment that's been tried in Sweden has not been tried in the United States because I think of the largely mistaken assumption of the journalists that they were going to benefit from Google and Facebook, and that the journalists really wanted the eyeballs. They didn't want to erect paywalls. They didn't want to limit access. And I've been at the journalism school at Columbia now since 2009, and I was very surprised when the journalists were making that argument, because it seemed to me to be suicidal, and they've now come around to that view. It's an interesting experiment. If it's worked in Sweden, maybe it'll be tried in the United States, but to my knowledge, it hadn't been tried yet, and it might well run afoul of antitrust.
We
It
have
also
time.
might run afoul
So
of the
this
First Amendment.
this gets to a tension in antitrust law, particularly the way that we've pursued it recently. So in I guess it was 2011 or 12, the major book publishers got together with Apple and they said, hey, we have this problem where Amazon's Kindle is monopolizing ebooks. And Amazon was forcing
Right.
publishers to set all book prices at $9.99, which is crazy to price, a well-researched biography of Cornelius Vanderbilt at $9.99. It takes years to write, and like the fart book, like a book of fart jokes, right? They're not comparable products, but Amazon was like, we're just going to set it all at $9.99. And so, the publishers got together with Apple and they said, you have this thing called the iPad. We want to work with you to create a different store that can compete with the Kindle, where we set the prices. They wouldn't fix the prices, but they say we would set the prices for our books like we do when we sell print books to bookstores. So what the Obama administration did, and the guy who did it was a very left-wing guy, he said, oh, wow, look at all these publishers and Apple getting together to talk about prices. There are emails where they're talking about prices. That's price fixing. Oh my gosh. And then so they sued Apple and the book publishers for price fixing. And so they wielded the sword of antitrust on behalf of the monopolist. And it was totally devastating to the book industry. And Amazon now has enormous control over the book industry. But the FTC, which is the regulatory enforcement agency, has been doing this in all sorts of ways. They've been going after the little guy. So in the US, it would be like the newspapers want to get together so that they can bargain with Google and Facebook over the amount of advertising revenue that they're getting. Because the intermediary is just taking a huge amount. Well, they're not allowed to, because that would be a cartel-like behavior, and the antitrust authorities would go after them. It's why Capper-Volstead in the 20s was passed to protect farmers who didn't have market power, allowed them to come together in cooperatives. Well, newspapers aren't allowed to do that in the US for some reasonable reasons. It's just that what you find is that the FTC, the Obama FTC and the Trump FTC, has gone after the little guy. They've gone after those dastardly ice skating teachers, those terrifying music teachers. They've sued church organists. It's been this, they're really, going after the politically weak groups of people that are getting together. They've gone after Uber drivers. They're essentially trying to put forward quasi-unionizing activities or activities to promote small businesses. And that's the dynamic that we have today. It's very similar to the 1890s when the Sherman Act, which was passed to handle the Standard Oil and a whole series of trusts, was in turn used to attack labor unions. And that's where we are right now. And a lot of people don't understand that, and they don't understand that this is what the Obama administration did. But it is where we are right now, and it's something that we have to reckon with.
And this is just a follow-up. One reason I think it's important when we think about checking prerogatives, checking power, checking privilege, that we distinguish between anti-monopoly and antitrust, because there are many anti-monopoly tools that are distinct from antitrust. And I think that's sometimes lost in public discussion.
Well, it's really a technical distinction. It's something lawyers play with and, use for their clients, but it's not something that sort of filters down into everyday conversation. It doesn't even take place in newspapers.
So you have to kind of look for it, you have to study for it, you have
To study,
to find the differences between anti-monopoly and antitrust.
the founders were anti-monopolists, 19th century anti-monopoly. Sherman Anti-Trust Act was enacted in 1890, and there have been many, some of the anti-monopoly measures that both of you so well described didn't have to do with antitrust. Breaking up the banks, for example, in the 1930s had nothing to do with antitrust. So if the limits of our imagination are what's going to go on in the antitrust division of the Justice Department and what's going to go on in the FTC, it seems to me that we are missing an opportunity to think creatively about the problem posed by concentrated economic power.
Okay, well, you all have your homework, and I want to thank you all and thank our panelists for a great session, and have a good evening.
Well done. Okay.
Thanks for answering the question.
I hope I didn't blow it.